So today we have our very own Jill Butler Rennie on our podcast. Jill, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Jill is a lead environmental and safety strategist, consultant. Jill, you have your career spans over 20 years. You have worked in the high hazard industries with many clients. And your area of expertise kind of splits between environmental and safety. And specifically, when we talk about the safety in the high hazard industries, there's a critical aspect, or there's a critical area around process safety that often doesn't get talked about too much. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into process safety management aspect, and we're going to understand that what are the key principles. So why don't you give us a very high level overview about the process safety management?
Okay, so like all management systems, the PSMS, as we would call it, is just a framework to organize policies, procedures, work instructions to, deliver effective operations. And again, like other management systems, it's based on a plan, do, check, act model. Mm-hmm. So you plan what you're going to do, how you're going to conduct your operations. You do it according to the plan. You check whether everything has gone according to your plan, and then act where it hasn't. So typically over the last few years on the PSMS projects that I've worked on, we've been using the Energy Institute's high-level framework for PSMS. So this is 20 elements that are spread out throughout the plan, do, check, act model. And we just work through each of them to implement effectively, safe operations.
And you've been supporting a lot of our clients in the high hazard industries, working with the idea. When it comes to the process safety management, as consultants, we take certain role in the overall PSM strategy, where we bring our expertise to the client and support them in discrete areas. However, what I understand when it comes to the PSM, it's a much wider aspect of managing process safety in our workplace, and especially when you're running manufacturing plants and facilities which are storing, producing, or transporting high hazard, flammable liquids. So when it comes to the companies and them implementing process safety management, where's the biggest gap? Where do you see the biggest gap when you're working with these clients?
Well, the thing with the management system is to really be effective, is it has to include every single element in an organization, every single department. It's that far-reaching. So the gaps really depend on the sophistication of the culture there, how developed the culture is, what other management systems they've got in place, how well documented things are. It cannot go ahead. You can't even begin to put pen to paper with a management system unless you've got the key leadership elements in place. And that is always the gap. I mean, people typically come for PSMS support because something has gone wrong, or there's been a regulatory intervention. In the most part, it's come from not being able to preempt these challenges, not understanding the legislative requirements, and not having the right leaders in place.
So it could be a knee-jerk reaction to something that has happened on site. Yeah. And then you're obviously trying to think from all the angles. Mm-hmm. But am I right to say that the PSM, or process safety management, gives you a more structured way of thinking holistically to say which areas of the process safety management and how you implement them? So starting with the culture, it's quite interesting that you talk about the cultural aspect and how, what do you mean? Can you expand on the cultural aspect and the leadership? Because these things start from the top in any companies.
So, I mean, we kind of define culture as this is how we do things here. And this is how we do things when people aren't looking. Mm-hmm. That obviously is a huge boundary to the implementation of PSMS. The documentation and the framework that we work within can only take an organization so far. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think it's important to have the paperwork in place first. Mm-hmm. And then you've got somewhere to start from with the cultural development. We're at a point with some of the projects that we've worked on where we've taken the paperwork elements as far as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And we still find that operatives are making mistakes, not following work instructions, for example. Mm-hmm. and they're not being taken to task for it. So what we, call in some other sectors would be a just culture.
Okay.
So people don't necessarily get the blame for things that they've done wrong, but at some point people have to be accountable for their personal responsibility as well. And when we have leaders who aren't leading by example, then the operatives don't have examples to follow.
Okay, so would you say process safety management is a subset of our overall, obviously more often than not when we go to these plants, you see a lot of write-ups around occupational health and safety. Would it be fair to say that PSM is a subset of overall safety and occupational health and safety is one part of it, while process safety management is almost like another strand to the overall safety culture when you're speaking in the context of high hazard industries?
I would say it was a strand to the cultural conversation. I personally think it's quite different from the occupational, the safety management system, because that's looking at high frequency, low severity events, whereas process safety management is the complete opposite. Obviously, there is some baseline activities, sort of cultural nuances that we would want to see across all of the activities. But when we are launching this with a new client, we put up a slide that says, you've got your business management system at the top, and then under that you've got environmental management, safety management, quality management, and then PSMS.
Okay.
So those kind of pillars
sit
alongside at that level.
Okay.
Now there is lots of overlaps, and actually sometimes you could almost show this as a Venn diagram, because management of change, for example, that applies to all of those other management systems as well.
When we often talk about the leadership aspect, and you were talking about these pillars that generally sit under the quality management system, whether it's environmental management, quality management, safety management, and specifically process safety management, generally we see the leadership that is often responsible for these all have an area of expertise in one specific pillar that we talked about. How would you say that if a big organization established trying to bring a change, how can they empower and put right leaders in place to drive the process safety management aspect?
So, without leadership, you've obviously got nothing here. There's various leadership elements, I think, to an effective system. We need somebody at the very top who is absolutely accountable and also has access to resources. So effectively somebody who is a budget holder, and certainly somebody who can say, assign resources in terms of finance or people or expertise where it's needed. Now, we all recognize that top management sign safety policies, environmental policies, quality policies, but in PSMS, and certainly most of the sites that we work with, they have MAPs, major accident prevention policies. And this is where the leaders set out their process safety intent and talk about how, as the name suggests, they prevent major accidents. And that really is the cornerstone of everything that falls from it.
Yeah. So I think it's good that you touched on the point about resourcing, because we often see that there's a constraint around the resourcing. Yeah. So you could have a right leadership, but if you don't have enough resources to deliver this on the ground, and I think it's quite interesting. This is where companies like IDEA, who obviously have process safety engineers at all levels, all the way from graduates to principal level, they can take on discrete activities depending on where client needs support. Yeah. So it could be an in and out, do this risk assessment for me, or it could be a secondment of a sort where our engineer would go support and help drive some of these things. If somebody starting from the start, and it's a new plant, it's a new distillery, it's a new production facility, how can they do things right at the start, rather than in an established organization where it's quite hard to do things retrospectively when you're trying to bring changes from the top down? How can new companies, who are in in their second, third year of operation, can do to make sure that they would adapting this framework and somebody being accountable for it, and then working with companies externally to make sure that the right resourcing is maintained? Would you say that?
So, again, we go back to leadership. We have to have the right person at the top, or the right person driving it, and then the structure sort of formalized within a policy. Now, I mentioned that there's 20 elements to this particular framework. Organisations at the beginning of the journey may not need all 20. Depending on the industry, stakeholder engagement, for example, isn't such a big deal for some. In oil and gas companies, stakeholder engagement is very, very, very important. In the whiskey industry, it can be something as basic as the distillery manager, hosting an annual barbecue or something with the local community. So that's very different. Some of the sort of key things might be less important than what an engineer would think. So, for example, information management. Unless you've got a robust document management system, then you haven't got any way to, create and manage documents. And that includes engineering drawings, which is, as we've all seen, a weakness in a lot of places.
Do you think that's where it becomes overwhelming for the clients? Because when you're trying to address these different aspects of the process safety management, it often requires you to have some sort of prerequisite to be in place. And document management, good, robust document management system is one aspect. Having a good management of change system in place is quite key. And I think that's where it becomes overwhelming for the companies, where they have to then go back and say, okay, who is going to do that part? And it's almost like a cascade effect that either you throw the towel in and say, it's too much, or you say, okay, how can I take steps? So I think what's important is to establish a timeline and prioritize that, how we can get to, what our vision is and how we can get there. So when you are working with the clients on a strategy, how do you establish the timeline for them to, obviously get better than where they were last year? And then looking at next year, does it become the part of their 5-year plan like they have for CapEx projects? How do you often work with them when it becomes too overwhelming for the clients?
Everybody's different. Everybody's on a completely different journey. And the only thing you absolutely have to deliver with a management system, aside from legal compliance, is continual improvement. But without the building blocks, then that timeline could be very, very extended.
Yeah, I think that's where we see that either clients can put I think that's where Energy Institute guidelines help you to do. It allows you to establish a timeline where you say, what are my high priority items and what is something that requires more kind of prerequisites that makes it a bit challenging for them, because that needs to happen before they can address all the building blocks that are often required. So we talked about management of change just there, which is often very poorly done in some of the plants. What are your thoughts when you are carrying out this strategy work with the clients on the process safety management?
So, I mean, there's a number of points associated with management of change. And I think the first one that really defines everything that comes after it is that a lot of people see management of change as simply an engineering change, when actually we need to be looking at organisational, operation, personnel. So, for example, I was auditing a large oil and gas facility, and they didn't consider organisational, operational change. And in this particular example, they were changing out the document control company, so the company that provided them with the external IT. And that included, as I said earlier, P&IDs. All their engineering drawings went into this one database. Now, they hadn't assessed the potential damage that could do to their operations, which, to my mind was absolutely catastrophic. So yes, it's important to manage the small engineering change, dropping out a pipe spool, a new pump, but things like that you don't necessarily, as an engineer, see as being important, to my mind, are equally important within the overall management of change process. The next part is people don't risk rank the change. So they would apply the same process to even a minor modification versus a whole new project. So not only is that not necessary, but if you expect operatives, project engineers to apply a very clunky process to a small change, then it puts them off doing that, as frequently as they potentially should.
When it comes to process safety management, are there any resources available to these companies from where they can adopt templates that can be, that can help them fast track the implementation?
So if you look at the 20 elements, the majority of those will already be covered to some extent within your other management systems.
Sure.
And certainly we haven't implemented this in any organization that didn't have even a basic safety management system.
Sure.
So there really isn't anything that should be brand new to a company within these 20 elements. It might be a slightly different approach as to how you manage them. It might ask you to go in more detail. So, for example, a formal safety assessment element, you wouldn't see that level of detail in a safety management system under ISO 18001.
Okay.
But in terms of templates, management systems are kind of well known, well rehearsed. Everybody has their own style because everybody needs something different out of them.
Also, PSM, when it comes to the it's all about kind of learning from experience, implementing. How can companies, based on the past incidents, what have happened, how can they learn and improve so that they can prevent major accidents in the future? How would you say, where does the PSM comes in about learning from the past experience?
So in the ACT section, the last 4 elements, then we've got, event recording and analysis, performance assurance, audit, and continual improvement. And so it's a combination of all of those 4 elements that are going to deliver lessons learned effectively. One of the weaknesses that I've seen in every organization that we've been in to do this is sort of a lack of competency and awareness and root cause analysis. So if you are not identifying the root cause analysis from, not only significant incidents, but also near misses and lower level events, if you're not identifying the root cause analysis from them, then your corrective actions will never actually correct the original problem. Yeah. So that's one thing. And most places we go to, you can certainly see reoccurring themes of incidents. Okay. Performance assurance is around, are you measuring the right metrics in your business? So everybody measures, for example, number of accidents, lagging indicators. What we don't see so much of is a smart approach to leading indicators. So for an example, number of maintenance work orders complete.
Okay.
So that would give you an indication of, obviously, the focus of the organization on maintenance. We can then understand the difference in their approach to preventative and reactive maintenance, for example. And that all comes under the asset integrity element.
I think we often see that, obviously, a part of the work that we do in IDEA is all around designing. And when we're working with companies where we are being given to deliver a design work on a project where they are trying to bring a change, there is a point of handover which is quite important, which I often feel as there's a faded line at times. By the time we finish, we would have taken the existing drawings and documents, we would have carried out all the design work. And once we finish, the handover aspect is quite crucial to that, because when we are issuing those things back to the companies, we don't know what happens with those documents. And if they don't have the robust system in place where they can, manage document that has been given to them, then it can also lead to issues, because you could be, there's a chance you could be working with outdated items. So it goes back to the document management part, or the document, bringing management of change. How do you think the management of change and the document management aspects are linked? And, given that the what it can cause if you haven't updated the things once it's being kind of issued back to you, from the point of view of delivering the project after the project, because generally the asset is owned by or run by operations and maintenance team, while the projects are delivered by the project team in these companies.
So performance assurance is around making sure that you're measuring the right things suitable for your business, because we don't want to be in an Emperor's New Clothes situation where you're not aware of what's going on around you and people are just telling you the data that they want you to know.
Okay.
So that's always a weakness. And a lot of, we talked about templates and examples before, industries typically have their own benchmarks and things that they like to see recorded under the performance assurance banner. It's not always implemented because organizations don't necessarily have the mechanisms to capture the data.
Okay.
And one thing that we see about an ineffective management system is actually it just becomes a data dump, and it sucks data, it sucks resources out of a company, but it doesn't give you anything useful out the other end.
Sure.
And that, moving on to the next element of how we look at lessons learned is through audit. And that's what an audit can ultimately tell you. So we would expect to see an internal audit program, even in the smallest organization. And within that, it's going to be looking, for example, at document control, at management of change. And I'm always surprised when we see a very detailed audit plan and a whole team of auditors, but all the audits tell you that there's nothing wrong. And yet you talk to an engineer and they're like, oh, we're not very good at management of change.
Yeah.
Well, how can I see that? Where is the data set that says you're not very good at that? Where is the corrective action from an audit?
Sure.
And unless something's written in an audit, then the senior management don't necessarily ever know about it. And I think we've all seen the iceberg where it's only a tiny proportion of a company's challenges that ever reach the top level, because the tools that the lower levels have at their disposal aren't necessarily as effective, and they're not collecting the right information.
So I think the way companies are set up or the organizations are set up, there is a maintenance team, there is operations team, which is, obviously responsible for running and managing the day-to-day operations. And there's projects team, which is obviously trying to bring the change and implement new projects, whether it's expansion, debottlenecking around these areas. And all of these are the stakeholders who have, part to play and contribute to the overall process safety management. Do you think there's a communication issue between the leadership and people working on the ground and trying to deliver? Either they haven't been really informed what's expected of them, or when they are delivering the work and they find out issues which are probably not getting captured through audits and being obviously sent up the way.
So we find typically in any management system, the layer of middle management are almost like a block from down, because they don't necessarily pass the information to the highest level and they don't feed it down in the right channels. Communication is obviously an ongoing problem in pretty much every organization that we go into. And it needn't be. It's one of the easiest things to put right, but you need to identify that that's a problem in the first place. And having, a weekly meeting or a monthly meeting isn't going to solve all of those problems. It needs to be multiple channels and multiple mechanisms to communicate. It needs to be the right type of communication to the right group of people at the right time. And of course, workforce engagement is its own element in a PSMS.
So doesn't it surprise you when you're working on the strategy, especially with bigger companies, that there appears to be a strong link between the process safety management and the regulatory compliance, and yet you see so many companies struggling? Because if there's one driver to say that what happens if we are not on top of process safety management, is that it can, obviously show company in a bad light. And when you're working with the regulatory bodies, you may not meet all the... So what would you say about the link between the regulatory compliance and having a strong process safety management process in place?
So as with all management systems, a key element, in fact, it's element 2, so that's how important it is around regulatory compliance.
Okay.
And, typically you would expect to see a regulatory register, so just a list of every single piece of legislation that's relevant to that operation. Maybe in a spreadsheet or a table. And then as you would move to the right of the spreadsheet, it would explain how the organization demonstrates their compliance with it. Now, some places don't even have that. So my question to them is always, how do you know you're compliant? Because you can't show me what you need to be compliant with.
Yeah. And is there a part where they're unaware until they are actually told by HSE and other companies that they were actually meant to meet this regulatory requirement because it's very much obviously applicable in their cases. And I would like to assume that there are companies who may not be necessarily ignoring it, but again, I think it goes back to how much importance you give to ensure that you're paying attention and you're setting a right framework in place, that otherwise it can get lost, and it's hard to then stay on top of it.
And another element to that is, very often you see people in the different departments or the different engineering disciplines, for example, will have a list of the legislation relevant to them, but it's in isolation to everybody else. So again, it comes back to having a focal point and a leader who has a sound overview of everything, so you can see all the collaborations where they're needed, the interrelations between everybody else.
Sure. So it's not easy by any means.
No, it's not, but it's very doable.
Okay.
Because it's actually a straightforward, stepwise process.
Okay.
There's no hidden agenda with any of it. It's just a list of activities to do.
So Jill, management change is a key aspect of the process safety management, which we often see companies get wrong. What would be your advice?
So we've already touched on the need for inclusion with operational and personnel change, and also the requirement or the good practice to risk rank, to understand the level of approach that you need to take. The other thing that happens is the right people aren't around the table. So you do need subject matter experts in the particular change. Mm-hmm. You also need, typically in distillery operations, for example, the project engineer will be there, but also somebody from HSE to kind of keep everybody on the right track in terms of how to follow the process. Mm-hmm. And without all of that buy-in, then again, this is just not going anywhere. Okay. I think most importantly, and most of the time, this is the change that we like to make to people's MOC procedures. It's the business of having gated stages. So you have your initial meeting, you agree some actions. Those actions have got to be completed before the next stage of the process starts. And if that doesn't happen, you can find yourself at the end of a project. The project is about to go live and nobody's completed any of their actions.
Right.
Now, again, and not surprisingly, that ties back to accountability and leadership. So what I would also say here is you need to identify a specific person to run the management of change process. And it wouldn't be the project engineer because they're too closely related. Somebody who's got an overview. And that overview role will also have an understanding of cumulative risk, for example, of different projects on the same facility.
Okay.
Which a project engineer working in isolation wouldn't necessarily understand the impact of their job on a project which is happening in the next module.
Yeah, I mean, when I have worked as a project manager in these companies, you often, at the start, when you're putting together a statement of requirements for the project, and there's often a section around regulatory compliance, and it actually goes to all the signatories, and one of the signatories from the SHE team or site, health and safety team would have input from the process safety point of view. And I think that is a key, because they need to be informed in the first place that something is about to happen, so that they can give their input at the right time. And then it's up to the project manager to ensure that it's executed through the project. And once the project is being handed over, all those actions are captured, and ensure that those things are implemented as part of the delivery of the project.
And it actually works much better in a project situation. What we see, and just this has happened in the last probably the 18 months, if the project engineer is there and it's a significant sized piece of work that warrants a project engineer, then the management of change is flagged up. If it's a job that isn't managed at that level, then that's when it falls through the cracks.
So this could be maintenance personnel making changes which doesn't necessarily fall under a projects which is being delivered, exactly. And they might not be as informed as an engineering team about some of these things. So I would like to assume that there will be a process in place to ensure that when a work order comes to maintenance department to make a change, they ensure that they are speaking to right personnel in the company and make them aware that this change is happening in case that has any. That's an interesting point, because you could have very different sort of set of people implementing.
And it might just be it's a temporary change. So we would always advise to identify what's a temporary change, and that would be a lighter process to apply. For example, you're dropping out a a fuel gas flow meter just for 12 hours for maintenance. That doesn't need 10 pages of assessment, but it could have a compliance challenge.
Right, that's an interesting point. Before we finish, what would be your advice for people starting on the journey to implement process safety management in their companies, small or big?
So I mean, obviously I've been doing this for my entire career, but I don't think that you should ever be overwhelmed by this. When you look at the page of 20 elements, it does look like a lot, but another analogy is, how to eat an elephant, and it literally is just one bite at a time. You might not work through the elements in the order that they're in. There is no organization that has nothing in place. So you just need to, take an overall view of the 20 elements. And the first thing that we always do is a gap analysis as to where the organization is now and where they would like to be.
Sure.
Most companies don't necessarily want a gold-plated system initially because that is just too difficult to achieve. That is something for 10 years down the line. But we rarely see an organization that has nothing. I mean, as I've already mentioned, there's so many overlaps between an IMS, the EMS, the QMS, the SMS. There is always something that we can initially work with. So don't be overwhelmed. It is a framework. It's just a framework to work within.
Just to guide you.
Yeah. It's just a guide. Yeah. And it can look however you need it to look.
Okay. So I think that's very interesting that when you do this analysis at the start, people may be calling it something else.
Yeah,
and they just don't realize that it actually, you're already doing it. You just don't know where it fits overall. And there's a shared responsibility between the different management systems.
Yes.
Where often things can get quite confusing that who actually owns and who is a contributor to those aspects. But if this process allows them to have an absolute clarity between the boundaries, between the different management systems, then really can help them to. Jill, thank you very much for sharing your expertise today with us.